A Cornish Maid. Side 15. Dolly sat bolt upright, and the next minute she was on her feet, her hands on her hips, her eyes practically spitting fire as they confronted one another. "What the bleeding hell do you mean by calling me a tart? You always think yourself so bloody superior to me, don't you? Just because I know how to have a good time, don't pretend that you ain't thought about doing the same, Miss High and Mighty." "Having a good time doesn't have to involve getting a bad reputation, which is the way you'll end up," Amber shouted. "Oh, yes? Well, I ain't got much else to think about in this dreary hole, have I? You never wanted me here, and God knows why I stay." "Why don't you go, then? I'm sure your mother can find another Uncle Joe for you, with all her dubious connections," Amber said insultingly. This was too much for Dolly. She lunged forward, grabbing Amber's long hair and pulling it hard. Amber screamed, retaliating at once, yanking and twisting Dolly's blonde curls and making her yell with pain. And then they were hitting, scratching and punching, digging their fingernails into one another's skin, losing their balance and sprawling in an ungainly heap on the floor. They were shrieking at one another like fishwives until Amber finally got the better of Dolly. She straddled her, forcing her arms back on the floor, her own chest heaving with fury over what was happening. But Dolly wasn't done with her yet. "You think you're so bleeding clever, don't you?" she screamed. "But I don't think you're as prissy as you make out. I saw the way you was dancing with Bart What's-His-Name last night, and I saw the way he had his hands all over you when you left the club. You was hot for it, bitch, just as I was, and don't tell me you ain't never done it, because I just don't believe ya." "What do you mean?" Amber snapped. "What do you think I mean? Don't act dumb with me, Amber Penry." Dolly yelled right in her face, while still trying to get her arms out of Amber's fierce grip. "I'm bloody well sure you've done it, same as me. And what do you think Lukey boy's going to say about that when he finds out he's got soiled goods?" If Amber had been flushed before, she felt as if her whole face was on fire now. Of course she had done it, as Dolly put it so crudely, but it wasn't any nasty bit of fumbling in a dark corner or in the back of a jeep. It had been one beautiful, wonderful experience with a man she loved, and Dolly Nash had effectively ruined that lovely memory the way she ruined everything. She released Dolly with a suddenness that took them both by surprise, and then Dolly was rubbing her sore arms and looking up at Amber with narrowed eyes. "Well now, country girl, it don't take a genius to see that I was right. Your face gives you away. So, now I reckon you ain't going to say anything when Lukey boy comes home and I have a go at him myself, are you? Not if you don't want him to know how you've been playing around with the Yanks while he's been at sea." "You disgust me," Amber said, her voice harsh and shaking. She got up from the floor, feeling dirty and ashamed. "I have never played around with any Yank. And Bart was a perfect gentleman last night when I wasn't feeling well. You were the one who never came home, and God knows what you were up to. He knows, but I don't want to know about your grubby little goings-on. I don't want to talk to you or look at you." "Suits me," Dolly snapped. "Until I decide what I'm going to do, I'll keep my own rations and do my own cooking. Then, as long as I'm allowed to use your pots and pans. Will that please your ladyship?" Amber bit her lips hard. She couldn't help thinking how Granny Penn would have hated all this, and how sad and horrified she would be at the way her two girls were tearing one another apart. Granny Penn had been fond of Dolly, even if she hadn't been one of her own. "Well?" Dolly demanded in the small silence. "Is that what you want?" One of them had to be magnanimous and break this deadlock. It wasn't backing down, it was being grown up and sensible. Amber took a deep breath. "No, it's not what I want. While we're still living in the same house, I want us to be civilized. We may not like each other very much right now, but we've shared a lot of years together, Dolly, and I don't want it to end like this." Dolly didn't say anything for a minute, and then she shrugged. "I'll better start the supper then," she said. It was impossible to think that everything was going to be back to normal after that. Too many hurtful things had been said. Too many accusations had been thrown on both sides. Each of them knew they were only marking time, being forcibly polite to one another, waiting. What exactly were they waiting for? Amber wondered. Waiting for the war to end, like everyone else, as it dragged inexorably on towards another Christmas. Waiting for Luke to come home with a worry over his injuries, and now the added tension of what Dolly had said, and knowing she would do exactly what she had threatened. She would have a go at Luke herself, and if Amber objected, she would tell Luke that his whiter-than-white girlfriend had been playing around with the Yanks while he had been at sea. Amber had no doubt she would do as she said. It seemed to prove something Amber should have seen a long time ago, ever since Dolly first came to the cottage. A thin, miserable little girl with blonde curls and big blue eyes, who she had never realized could be so calculating. Wanting to fit in, wanting to be friends, wanting Amber's friends, wanting Amber's gran, wanting everything that Amber had. Dolly was acquisitive, wanting what everyone else had, and now she wanted Luke. It probably wasn't even that she wanted him for any other reason but that he was Amber's boy, and she would never have him, Amber vowed savagely. It was clear to everyone now that the Allies were winning the war. The big question was not when, but how soon. Rommel had committed suicide in October, and if that wasn't an indication of how desperate the enemy was getting, they didn't know what was, said the local sages. All the Allied fronts reported victories in pushing back the enemy and gaining ground. At home, the fact that the Home Guard had been stood down gave everybody fresh hope that the final victory couldn't be very far away now. As far as Amber Penry was concerned, she was just desperate to know whether or not Luke would be home before Christmas, for this was one that she especially wanted to share with him. In her saner moments, she brushed aside all thoughts of Dolly Nash's silly threats, because she knew that Luke loved her and wouldn't pay any attention to evil gossip. All the same, she wouldn't feel completely secure until he was home again and she could see for herself. The Gillams were well known in the town, and the news that their son was one of the survivors from the Tigress had quickly spread. At church, on the Sunday, after the account appeared in the local newspaper, the vicar made a special point of remembering Luke and giving thanks to the Almighty for having spared him. After the service, friends and acquaintances congratulated Mick and Hester as if it was they who had done something marvellous. There were small groups around the couple on that crisp December morning, wanting to know the details and where Luke was right now, and Amber felt totally detached from it all. Luke wasn't her relative, and they weren't married or officially engaged, or even walking out together as far as most people knew. She had no rights to any warm words from well-wishers, the way his parents had rights. She had no claim on him, other than what they both knew in their hearts, and as yet she had no idea if Luke's hazy memory would even permit him to remember how close they had been. Hester Gillam caught sight of Amber standing awkwardly by the church gate and waiting for her friend Dolly to catch up with her, when she could tear herself away from the group of young servicemen she was talking to. Ever since that fateful night following the dance at the Forces Club, they had kept their distance as much as possible, but as if by tacit consent they kept up the semblance of friendship as far as outsiders were concerned. "There's no need to look so anxious, Amber," Hester told her quietly. "As soon as we hear when they'll be sending Luke home, you'll be the first to know, and you know you can call at the house any time you like. I realise it must seem as if we're getting all the limelight here today, my dear, but it's hardly the kind of limelight we would have chosen, I assure you. Of course it's not, Amber said hurriedly, wondering just how petulant she had appeared. I do understand, Mrs. Gillam, and of course I'm glad that people are so pleased for you. But you're feeling left out. I know I shouldn't be, but yes, if I'm honest, that's exactly how I feel. I know it's silly, but I can't help it. It's not silly at all. Luke is lucky to be loved by so many people. It was hardly as personal as hearing her say that Luke was lucky to have a girl like Amber to love him, but she had to be content with that, knowing there were other people around, and that Dolly was tripping her way towards them now. I'm really looking forward to having Luke home again, Mrs. Gillam, Dolly told Hester, gushing. I can't wait to hear the tales he'll have to tell about his time at sea. He must have been so brave. Amber couldn't believe her gall, insinuating herself into the conversation and pushing herself forward as if she was the girl Luke would be coming home to see. Hester gave a slight smile. I doubt that Luke will be anxious to say very much about those times, Dolly. As for being brave, it goes without saying that they're all brave. War makes men out of boys. She moved away to join her husband, and Dolly scowled, not missing the fact that she had been put in her place. Well, that was a pretty senseless thing to say, wasn't it? Amber said coldly. Do you really think all that gush cut any ice with his mother? Oh, don't give her monkeys. It's not his mother I'm interested in. She blew a mocking kiss towards Amber and strolled off. If ever Dolly was showing her true colours, Amber seethed. She was doing it now, all right. It was a pity nobody else could see beyond the sugary prettiness. It was impossible for Amber to keep away from the boatyard in the next couple of weeks. The news from Alexandria was frustratingly slow, and having studied an old map of the area and seen just how far away the Egyptian port was, Amber realised how long it would be before Luke came home, even when he was fit enough to do so. The trouble was, the longer it took, the more afraid she was over the extent of his injuries, and what the authorities weren't telling his family. The day finally came when Hester Gillam greeted her with a smile and a hug that was more effusive than usual. We've had positive news at last, Amber. Luke's head injuries were quite worrying, I understand, but his memory has returned and the deafness was only temporary. He'll recover completely, and he'll be due for an honourable discharge, which means his days at sea are over. Officially, that is. I can't imagine he'll stay away from boats and the sea forever, knowing how he and his father have always been so besotted by it. She was the one talking over fast now, Amber thought, as if she couldn't get the eager words out quickly enough. There were tears in her eyes too, and impulsively Amber hugged her back. It's wonderful news, Mrs. Gillam, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to hear it. Will he be home for Christmas then? She willed the woman to say yes, but her heart sank as she saw the smile slip a little on Hester's face. She shook her head. I don't think so. They want to keep him in Alexandria a little while longer, and then there's the voyage home to be arranged, and he'll be sent straight to a naval hospital to assess his progress before they finally discharge him. But that could take weeks, Amber said, the excitement disappearing fast. I know, but we just have to be patient and be thankful that at least he was one of the lucky ones. There were so very few of them, dear. Amber nodded, ashamed of her outburst. I can write to him now, though, can't I? I want to let him know, well, just things, she finished lamely. Of course you can. I'm going to write to him tonight myself. I know he'll be glad to get letters from home, but I'm sure the one he'll be looking out for will be the one from you. Amber blushed, knowing she had made her feelings too plain, but glad that Hester seemed to see nothing odd in it. She went home to the cottage with a piece of paper with the precious address in her pocket, determined that very night she was going to write to Luke, and she wasn't going to hold her feelings back. So, what's the latest? Dolly asked her, when they met at the cottage that evening. "Is Lukey boy coming home for Christmas?" "For goodness sake, stop calling him that," Amber said, nettled at once. "No, he won't be home for Christmas, but he'll be home eventually, and all in one piece, thank the Lord. They'll send him to a naval hospital in England once the Egyptian doctors have finished with him." "That's if he wants to come back to England," Dolly said slyly. "Don't be daft. Why wouldn't he?" "Well, I dare say he's had a pretty cushy time with all those luscious, dark-skinned little nurses looking after him and attending to his every need, if you know what I mean." "I hardly think I'd call having his ship torpedoed and sunk and being badly injured as having a cushy time." "Maybe not, but all the attention he got would have made up for it. Those Egyptian girls would be sure to make a fuss of a handsome bloke like our Lukey boy. I'm told they go for white-skinned boys." Amber glared at her. "If that's supposed to make me jealous, you're wasting your time. Can't you just be glad that he's safe and that he's coming home?" "Oh, I'm glad, all right. I can't wait," Dolly said with a platinum smile that was supposed to hide the barb. "Sometimes, Dolly, you make me sick," Amber told her, and went straight upstairs to her bedroom and slammed the door behind her. Immediately she'd done it, she clenched her hands tightly. This wasn't right. This was her home, and she shouldn't feel she had to come upstairs and hide herself away to avoid Dolly's vicious little insinuations. She hadn't even thought about the doctors and nurses who would be tending Luke. All she had felt was gratitude that they were making him whole again. Now Dolly had managed to spoil all that. She never seemed to hold on to a boy of her own for very long, and now she was making it her business to make Amber's faith in Luke waver. They used to be such friends, Amber thought, with a stab of regret. But all that was changed now. "Oh, damn and blast her," she muttered out loud. "I'm not going to think about her any more. There are more important things to think about." She went to the small bureau that had once been her gran's and now had pride of place in her bedroom to fetch writing paper and envelopes. She kept a photo of Granny Penn on top of the bureau, and she looked at it ruefully. "You'd hate all this, wouldn't you, Gran?" she said softly. "We never had any fights when you were around, did we?" Well, they certainly did, she remembered wryly, but they were childish fights, and never anything like this. If this was what happened when you grew up, then it would be better to remain children all your life, she thought fervently, while knowing that it could never be. "I'll make an effort, if she will, Gran," she said to the photo. And the next minute she jumped as she heard Dolly's mocking voice outside her door. "Talking to yourself again, girl? That's the first sign of going mad, in case you don't know it. Though I reckon you must be in the final stages by now." Her laughter echoed through the cottage, and then Amber heard the front door bang as Dolly went out for the evening. Up to more devil tricks, perhaps? She wrote Luke's name and address on an envelope, propping it up in front of her where she could see it, and revelling in the fact that it was going to reach him across the miles of land and sea, and that he would recognize her handwriting at once, because he had known it all his life. She began the letter, but it was more difficult than she expected. Somehow she was no longer in the mood for saying all that she wanted to say. She had imagined it would be so easy to write from her heart, to spill out all the love she had for him, and to tell him how much she was longing to see him again. But somehow the words wouldn't come, and the letter ended up as a few stilted sentences, and it was nothing like the way she had wanted it to be. She read it over, trying to see it through his eyes, and knew it wasn't right. It just wasn't right. "Dear Luke," she read, "your mum and dad have been keeping me up to date with all that's been happening, and I'm so relieved to know that you're going to be all right and will be coming home soon. It's a shame that you won't be home for Christmas, but all the signs are that 1945 is going to be a good year for all of us, and that this war will be over for good. We all miss you." She squirmed as she read those words. Who were all these people who were missing him for pity's sake? She didn't care about any of them, and it wasn't a personal enough message when what she really meant to say was that she missed him, that she was the one waiting for him. She screwed up the letter and threw it in her waste bin and tried again. But it was no good. She would leave it until later, maybe until tomorrow, when she could think more clearly. It was weird and depressing and frustrating, because she had always felt she could say anything to Luke, and now, when she wanted to say the most important things of all, the words failed her. She felt restless with the need to do something other than staying up here in her bedroom, or listening to the wireless, or reading a book. She glanced at her clock. It was still quite early on a fine December evening, and she decided to go for a cycle ride up to Pendennis Castle. Maybe being in some of the favourite places where she and Luke had gone so often, as children and as lovers, would dispel this strange feeling of unease at a time when she should be so happy. As always, the fresh, clean air did much to dispel the uneasy feelings and helped her to think more clearly. Instead of the negative feelings about how long it would be before Luke would be coming home, she began to feel more cheerful, more alive. It was going to happen, and they would be together again as they were always meant to be, and life would be wonderful. The awful war years would be behind them, and they could think of a shared future. Her heart gave a little flip of joy, imagining the day when she would walk down the aisle of the church on Luke's arm, dressed in white, a filmy veil over her face, a bouquet of roses in her hand. Then they would be together forever, for better or worse. But it would only be for the better, Amber thought positively. Good things were happening already. The hated barbed wire along the beaches had long been removed, and the ships of war that had filled the harbour were fewer now, and there were other craft bobbing about, regular craft, the ferries and fishing boats that busily plied their trade for people with more important things on their minds than the business of war, things like living and loving and raising children who were no longer under the threat of an invasion. She smiled at herself, wondering where all this philosophizing was coming from in a nearly 18-year-old. Everybody said it was one effect of the war, making people older before their time, making soldiers and sailors and airmen out of schoolboys, making widows out of young brides. Amber felt her smile waver, and she wished these black thoughts hadn't entered her mind again, just when she was beginning to feel more hopeful about the future. She had been out for more than an hour now, and the light was starting to fade, but since she knew every inch of the highways and byways of the town, she had no worries about getting home safely. All the same, there was a chill in the air, another reminder that Christmas wasn't so very far away. Amber forced herself to think that even if Luke wouldn't be home for Christmas, there was another new year just around the corner, and this was definitely the one that everyone said would bring all their men home. She was feeling decidedly calmer when she reached the cottage, her normal bubbling self returning fast. She turned on the wireless, her spirits lifting still more as she heard the rhythmic sounds of Victor Sylvester's dance music drifting out into the room instead of the constant war news. She hummed to the music as she dashed upstairs to her bedroom to hang up her coat, and then she stood very still. At first glance, nothing was amiss, and there was no reason to think anyone had been here. Dolly was out, and although nobody locked their doors in this area, burglars wouldn't find anything much to steal here. All the same, there was something. Amber closed her eyes tight, as if by shutting out her surroundings, her senses would tell her whatever it was that was wrong. Granny Penn always said that all the senses became more alert in total darkness. It drifted into her nostrils, then the pungent, sickly sweet scent of Dolly's perfume. Amber's eyes opened swiftly, knowing Dolly had been back, knowing she had been in here, in Amber's sanctuary. They had long ago agreed not to invade one another's privacy unless invited, but Dolly had been here for some reason. She looked quickly around the room. Nothing seemed to be disturbed. No drawers had been left half open. The cupboard where Amber kept her precious memory box was still closed. It didn't seem as if the waste bin had been rummaged through. There was just one thing. Amber's heart began to beat painfully fast as she went towards the bureau. The envelope, with Luke's address on it, ready for her to send him a letter, had been propped upright when she left the cottage, giving her a warm feeling by just knowing she could contact him there. Now, the envelope lay flat on the bureau. In an instant, Amber knew what had happened. Dolly had been here, copied out Luke's address in the Egyptian hospital, and planned to write to him herself. Maybe she had already done so, and there was little doubt about what poison she was going to tell him. Amber's shock turned to rage. The little bitch wasn't going to get away with it. She turned and ran downstairs, not bothering to turn off the wireless, even if it used up the whole accumulator. What did such things matter? She leapt on her bike again, regardless of the fact that it was colder now, and that she wasn't wearing a coat. She tore through the streets towards the Forces Club. Dolly didn't have a shift to do, but Amber was sure she'd find her there, toadying up to whoever would buy her a drink or ask her for a dance. At that moment, Amber hated her with a vengeance. She flung down her bike and went inside. Sure enough, there was Dolly, giggling and smirking with a couple of soldiers, and Amber saw red. She marched over to Dolly, grabbed her by the hair, and yelled in her ear, "You think you're very clever, don't you, bitch? Well, it's the last time you go into my room, because I'm having a lock put on it to keep you out, and the sooner you go back to whatever hole you climbed out of, the better." Dolly was gasping with pain now as Amber yanked at her blonde hair, but some semblance of sanity must have told her not to retaliate. Her blue eyes filled with tears, and she was blubbering like a baby. "I'm really sorry, Amber. I didn't mean to pry, honest. I just wanted to find my comb that you borrowed and forgot to give me back." She said it loudly enough and yet still whiningly enough for everyone around them to hear and to gain maximum sympathy for herself. The soldiers prized Amber's fingers away from Dolly's head, which she began to rub gingerly, while those around them looked at Amber in disgust at making such an unprovoked attack on her friend. Amber couldn't believe it. She had come here full of righteous indignation, and somehow she was turning into the bad guy. She was probably the only one who noticed the calculating look of triumph in Dolly's eyes, because nobody else knew what had gone on before. Hearing the muttering voices around her, clearly murmuring that Amber Penry was as mad as her grandmother, she turned and flounced out the way she had come, holding her head as high as possible, her eyes stinging with tears. Knowing she had made a fool of herself didn't help her feelings one bit. Nor did the realization that now that she had Luke's hospital address, Dolly was certainly going to spread her vicious lies to him, if she hadn't done so already. She rode back home, hardly seeing where she was going, since her eyes were smarting so much. Why couldn't she have waited instead of rushing into things the way she always did? But now she intended to write to Luke immediately and get her own letter in the post, and she was in no mood to hold back on her feelings, including the fact that she hoped Dolly would soon be leaving for Norfolk with her family, the way she kept hinting. There was nothing wrong in telling him that. She went to bed early, not wanting to be around when Dolly came home. She heard her, though, banging doors and singing tunelessly, obviously intending to annoy her even more. Amber didn't bite. She lay tensely in her bed, wondering if her bedroom door would burst open next and Dolly would start crowing over her again. It never happened, and eventually she relaxed and fell asleep, and when she got up the next morning, Dolly had already gone out. By the time they met again that evening, the atmosphere between them was icy, and the news they had to tell one another was delivered in as distant a way as possible. "I'm going to the Gillams for Christmas Day," Amber announced, having had the invitation from Hester that afternoon. "I'm going home for Christmas," Dolly said, "so we won't have to pretend to like one another, will we?" Despite her relief, Amber felt a sense of misery wash over her. What had happened to all the friendship they had shared over the years? The giggles, the secrets, the childhood indiscretions, the cosy sense of being us against the world. "Dolly, don't let's be like this," she said. "Well, you started it. Coming down to the club last night and making such a show of yourself." "I know. But it wasn't me who was snooping about in somebody else's room, was it? And don't deny it. I could smell that awful scent you wear. I had to open the window to get rid of it. The room practically needed fumigating." Dolly glared at her, and then her lips twitched. "You've got as big a bleeding nose as Granny Penn used to have, ain't ya?" she said in an exaggerated way. "I could never hide anything from her either. Anyway, what did you have in there that was so bleeding precious? I only wanted me comb back, and you can't deny that you'd borrowed it." Grudgingly, Amber wondered if she'd been wrong after all. It was true that she had forgotten to return Dolly's comb, which she was forever fussing about, and the envelope with Luke's address on it could just have fallen down. Perhaps she had even left it that way herself. There was still Dolly's determination to pursue Luke for herself, though, and the lies she intended telling him. "So, are we going to act like this from now on?" Dolly said, pushing the advantage as she saw Amber wavering. "I'm fed up with the silent treatment. Not that you were exactly silent last night, were you? Your temper don't improve with age, does it, girl?" "Neither does yours. But I don't suppose Granny Penn would want us to be at each other's throats all the time. And you're definitely going home for Christmas?" Dolly shrugged. "Said so, didn't I? I never say what I don't mean." Such a comment could well be double-edged, but Amber had to admit that Dolly was a better friend than an enemy, and if they had to live together, they just had to compromise. And who knew? Once Dolly went back to London for Christmas, perhaps she'd decide to stay, or at least make plans for moving to Norfolk with her mum and Uncle Joe. "All right, let's forget it," she said at last. "Ain't you going to say sorry for making such a fuss last night and nearly tearing me hair out then?" Dolly taunted. Amber gave a short, brittle laugh. "Don't push it, darling." She never did get around to asking someone to put a lock on her bedroom door, hoping that it was enough of a gesture to Dolly that she trusted her, even if she didn't. Not entirely. Both of them were glad when Christmas was only days away, and Dolly packed up her things and left for London. Maybe, when she returned, they would be able to feel more comfortable with one another, thought Amber. By then, she had had a garbled letter from Luke. She had scooped it up from the front doormat one morning, her heart leaping as she saw his handwriting on the envelope, thankful that Dolly wasn't there to ask who her letter was from. She took the letter to the outside lav in the yard so that she wouldn't be disturbed. The fact that his handwriting was far less firm than usual made her mouth tremble before she ripped the envelope open to read what Luke had written. "My dear Amber," she read, glorying in that one little word, my. He remembered that she was his Amber, his girl. "Sorry I haven't been in touch before, but the old head took a hell of a battering and I lost some days or weeks without knowing what really happened. This meant that when I recovered my memory, it was just as painful to learn about it all as when it first happened. I was luckier than a lot of my mates, and I know my mother has put you in the picture about what happened to the old tigress and to me. It will have been a shock to you, and to me, believe me. I was starting to think I had a charmed life, what with a piece of amber you gave me and everything. I've still got it, by the way, although God knows how it remained in my pocket. The nurses seemed to think it was something special. They put it on my bedside locker so that I saw it every time I opened my eyes, hoping it would trigger my memory. I suppose it did. Though for days I kept looking at it and frowning when the memories wouldn't come. And that only made the head pains worse. I'm only telling you all this so that you won't think I'm being odd if I go away to be on my own sometimes when I get home. When the head pains come, I don't want to be around anybody. The nurses here are wonderful, and they understand this, but I can't expect everybody to do so. I don't know yet when I'll be coming home, anyway, as they're sending me to some naval hospital when I leave here, but even if I'm still a bit battered and bruised, with any luck, I'll be home in time for your birthday. You see? I remember that. He finished by sending her love and saying he looked forward to seeing her soon. But by then Amber's eyes were filled with tears and her throat was choked with the effort of not crying out loud. She knew it wasn't only the realization that he was far from being the old Luke yet. It was shameful jealousy, raw and sharp, that these nurses who had cared for him, the nurses Dolly had referred to slyly as luscious, dark-skinned Egyptian girls, who were partial to white-skinned boys, obviously knew this Luke far better than she did now. They had sensed that his precious piece of amber was special, yet it had taken him days or weeks to remember it, or her. The sudden banging on the door of the lav made her jump. "What the bleeding hell are you doing in there, Amber? You're not the only one in need of a pee in the morning. Hurry up before I water the cabbages instead." Amber thrust the letter back in its envelope and slid it deep inside her pocket. There was no way she was going to let it out of her possession, especially for Dolly to find and gawp over. She opened the door of the lav and was almost knocked over as Dolly rushed in, still grumbling. Before she came out again, Amber was already on her way to work, red-eyed and heart-sore at all that had happened to her sweetheart, and wondering for the first time just how changed he was going to be when he came home again. Mrs. Veal went away to spend Christmas with her sister and wouldn't be back in Falmouth until the beginning of the new year. She had become more melancholy of late, often commenting that she wondered why she stayed in Falmouth at all now that father had gone, leaving her with so little interest in the shop. Amber spent Christmas with the Gillams, which was the next best thing to having Luke home, and by then they had heard the welcome news that he would be arriving at a naval hospital in Portsmouth in early January, and, if all went well, he would be home for good before the end of the month. "That's wonderful news. He said he hoped to be home in time for my birthday," Amber said joyfully, "although I haven't heard much from him lately." She tried not to sound petulant, but Hester told her that they had only had a brief letter from him too, wishing them a happy Christmas and sending his regards to Amber through his parents. It didn't sound like the words of a lover, but she steadfastly refused to have any bad omens about it, or to wonder if Dolly had really sent him a letter, filling his head with lies over what Amber had been up to with the Yanks. In any case, she had too much pride to ask her. There was still a certain amount of tension between the girls, but at least Amber was positive there had been no letter back for Dolly, because Amber made a point of always being downstairs when the postman came. It hadn't been that long, she kept telling herself, even though his parents had had that one letter from him at Christmas and she hadn't. All the newspapers were full of such optimism now, detailing the victories, large and small, that the Allies were achieving. No matter how happy the Christmas festivities, the talk inevitably turned to some aspect of the war, or the peace. Side 16. Almost for the first time, Amber began to wonder what it would be like to live in peacetime again. She had been a child when the war began, but she was a woman now. She was young and in love, and impatient for her lover to come home, and she didn't care if she was seeing the future through rose-coloured glasses. It was Luke's serious-minded father who pointed out a different side to it all, and Mick was quite adamant that there would be a period of adjustment for everyone.
How can it be otherwise when people have been away from their loved ones for so long? And I'm not just talking about Luke, nor making this a personal observation. But think of the past 5 years. We've all been caught up in it, whether we went to war or stayed at home. Our lives have changed, along with rationing and blackouts and heartbreak. Like every other town, we've been overtaken with military personnel. The Yanks have mostly come and gone, but we've all become used to a very different way of life from our ordinary peacetime routines. We're all different people now.
For heaven's sake, Meg, I think you'd better change the subject, Hester said. It's not very festive for Christmas evening, and you're scaring Amber. He's not scaring me, Mrs. Gillam, but he's making me see things from a different viewpoint, she admitted.
Mick nodded approvingly. You're an intelligent young girl, Amber, and you know as well as the rest of us that there's been tragedy as well as excitement, joyful reunions for some and dreaded telegrams for others. We've experienced it ourselves, and so has every other family. In fact, I doubt that there's one family in Cornwall that hasn't been touched by the war in one way or another.
Now, that's quite enough for one night, Hester said firmly. Why don't we all have a game of cards and remember that this is supposed to be a joyful occasion too? I don't want Amber going home feeling upset and gloomy. She glanced at the girl, seeing her downcast face. In fact, instead of going back to an empty cottage, why don't you stay the night, Amber? I don't know why I haven't thought of it before. Luke's bed is always made up. But it's up to you, of course, my dear. The offer took Amber by surprise, but she was never going to refuse, and a couple of hours later, when they had played cards until they were dizzy, drunk endless cups of cocoa, and finally eaten thinly filled mince pies, she was shown into the bedroom that was Luke's, wearing a borrowed nightdress from his mother. Minutes later, she was sliding beneath the cool covers of Luke's bed. It was something she had never dared to think about, and she wondered if Hester had had any idea how she would feel. How rapturous and poignant the moment when she breathed in the freshness of the cotton sheets and curled her arms around Luke's pillow, resting her cheek against it and caressing its softness, knowing this was where his head usually rested. She wished with all her heart that it was Luke that she held so close to her, and she tried to transmit her thoughts and her love across the miles to wherever he was right now. Dolly came back from London a few days after Christmas in a sullen mood, saying very little about the time she had spent with her mother and Uncle Joe, which to Amber meant that it hadn't gone well. In any case, Dolly was more interested in the New Year's Eve celebrations, which were to be held at the Forces Club. "You're coming with me, aren't you?" she asked. "You don't want to be sitting alone at home on New Year's Eve." It dawned on Amber that she was offering a grudging hand of friendship, and she wondered again what had gone on at home, and, even more, what was going on in that devious little mind of Dolly's. She didn't trust her, and never would. Her first instincts about Dolly, all those years ago, had been the right ones. But they had once been such friends, almost sisters, and she couldn't abandon those memories entirely. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, not giving an inch yet. "I wouldn't bloody well ask you if I didn't want you, would I?" Dolly said, back on form. "As long as you don't try to fix me up with some chap." "Would I?" Dolly said with a smirk. Anyway, I know you're still holding a torch for Lukey boy, she added, well into the habit of Hollywood slang now. I haven't been making any secret of it. Anyway, I slept in his bed on Christmas night. She said it casually, and she couldn't have had a better reaction if she'd given Dolly an electric shock. You what? You saucy cow! She shrieked, and then she saw Amber's smile widen, and of course she realised that Luke hadn't been there, and nor was he likely to have been sharing his bed with Amber in his parents' house. You're having me on, aren't ya? No, I'm not. It was very late when we'd finished playing cards on Christmas night, and Mrs. Gillam said I could stay the night. So, I slept in Luke's bed. God, it gave her such an enormous thrill, just saying the words. She had said them so many times to herself, and every time the sensations inside her were the same. I slept in Luke's bed. The only thing missing was Luke. My darling Luke. I bet you wished he was there too, Dolly said slyly. I bet you were imagining all sorts of things. Well, since you can't get inside my head, you'll never know, will you? Dolly giggled. Come on, girl. Where Luke is concerned, it wasn't inside your head that you was thinking about. Inside your knickers, more like. Amber didn't deign to answer that, nor to let her know how very near the truth she was. Of course she had been imagining Luke being with her, not in the crude way that Dolly was implying, but in a repeat of that wonderful first time in the cave, when they had been everything to one another. The memory of that one night could still jolt her when she least expected it, sending an exquisite rush of pleasure through her entire body. But Dolly wasn't going to know about that either. Well, I'll think about the New Year's Eve dance at the club, she said abruptly, since Dolly was still waiting for an answer. Now I've got better things to do than to stand here gossiping. She turned and pointedly went upstairs to her bedroom, closing the door behind her. What she had to do was to write to Luke, which she continued to do even if she hadn't heard from him, trying to make her letters bright and cheerful and sending them to the new Naval Hospital address in Portsmouth. By the time he arrived there, he'd have her letters waiting for him. She wasn't particularly looking forward to a dance on New Year's Eve. It would be even more exuberant this year, with everyone anticipating that peace was just around the corner, and people would let their hair down even more than usual. Dolly would be egging Amber on to do the same. She was still suspicious of this sudden offer of friendship, but when they arrived on that chilly night, the hall was full of bunting and balloons and excited chatter, and she couldn't help but be drawn into it. She wasn't an old fuddy-duddy, unwilling to join in the fun just because her boy wasn't home yet. Neither were plenty of others, and there seemed to be more than enough servicemen in the club to go around. One of them grabbed her round the waist and pulled her onto the dance floor as soon as the band struck up a lively tune. "I've been waiting a long time for this, sweetheart," he yelled in her ear as he whirled her around. "Have you?" she said. She knew who he was, even if she hadn't taken much notice of him at first. His name was Philip Slade, one of the old-school crowd, much taller and broader now, and sporting a thin moustache that was meant to make him look dashing, but only succeeded in making him look like a spiv. He was grinning down at her now with a lusty look in his eyes. "Ever since Dolly said you had a pash on me for a long time, I knew this was my night, especially with old Luke out of the picture." "What the hell are you talking about?" She was held far too tightly in his arms, and his hands seemed to be roaming far too familiarly over her rear. And there were too many other couples all pressing in on them now to break away. He clutched her even tighter. "Oh, come on. You're not that dumb. You've had your fun with the Yanks, but now they've gone, it's time to give the home-grown heroes a chance." She tried desperately to wrench out of his embrace, scarlet-faced at his insinuations, but he held onto her like a leech. "Dolly said I'd had a pash on you for a long time. she blurted out furiously. He laughed more boldly.
That's right, so don't try to deny it.
I do bloody well deny it, she snapped tearfully, realising that people were looking their way now and sensing that a scene was about to erupt. There's never been anybody for me but Luke, and Dolly's a liar and a pig for saying such things.
Well, that's not what she says, he went on, his voice uglier now. So, why not smile for the camera, sweet pants?
Too late. Amber saw a roaming photographer heading their way, intent on getting candid New Year's Eve snaps for the local newspaper, and the next minute a flash went off in front of her eyes as Philip Slade fastened himself to her and planted a kiss on her cheek.
That'll be a good one for the local gossips, he sniggered.
Amber was finally free of him, giving him a push that sent him staggering into the crowd and left him hollering. She didn't care. It was like a nightmare, and she knew exactly who had started it and the reason behind it. It was as if a bad film was unfolding in front of her eyes, in which she was coming off as the local tart. She knew she was getting things out of all proportion, but all she could think was that even though the photo may be only one of many in the newspaper to celebrate New Year's Eve, the Gillams would see it, and it would be the very one that Dolly would almost certainly cut out and send to Luke. As the Yanks would have said, she had been stitched up, made a patsy. She couldn't get the ridiculous phrases out of her head, and she was almost weeping as she forced her way through the dancers and out of the door into the cool December night. She didn't realise Dolly was close behind her until she grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going, you idiot? It's only a bit of fun, and Phil was more than ready to believe that you always had a secret pash on him." "Well, you know very well that I didn't," Amber yelled. "What do you think Luke's parents are going to think if that photo appears in the newspaper? I'm sure that was all part of your nasty little plan." "Bloody hell, Amber. You don't think much of me, do you?" "Are you going to deny it then?" Amber demanded. There was silence for a minute, and then Dolly shrugged. "Why should I? You got a pretty low opinion of me anyway." "So, this sudden burst of friendship was all in aid of getting a stupid photo of me and that oaf Philip Slade, was it?" She could hear the smile in Dolly's voice now, which didn't endear her one bit. "Well, it worked, didn't it, girl?" Amber turned on her heel. "The sooner you get out of my house and get back where you belong, the better. I can't bear to look at you any more." "That goes for me as well, you stuck-up twerp!" Dolly yelled after her, causing a group of latecomers to the dance to tut-tut at such goings-on at an evening of celebration. Amber tore away from the club, knowing her face must be flaming. She hardly knew where she was going or how far she had gone, but her footsteps inevitably took her up Pendennis Hill. She saw none of the beautiful moonlit panorama spread out far below her, nor the gentle rush of the sea against the cliffs, seeing and hearing nothing but the treachery of Dolly Nash. She was sick with embarrassment over what had happened, and even more so at the way the friendship between herself and Dolly had finally disintegrated. There was no going back now to the way things had been. She wanted Dolly out of the cottage and out of her life, no matter what she returned to in London. As the thought raged through her mind, she burst into noisy tears, because it should never have ended like this. Granny Penn would be horrified if she knew all that had gone on. She probably did know it, of course. The earthly body might be gone, but Amber was perfectly sure that somehow Granny Penn would know. Somewhere, in some other form, she would know. And just as surely as she thought it, a gradual sense of calm washed over Amber, because she had done nothing wrong. She had never betrayed the great love of her life for a single instant, not in thought or deed, and Granny Penn would know that and approve of it. It was Dolly who had organised the photographer to be around just when that slimy Philip Slade had her in his clutches. It was Dolly who was calculating enough to try to worm her way into Luke's affections, when anybody with half an eye could see that he and Amber were made for one another, always had been, and always would be. She almost leapt out of her skin when she heard somebody whisper her name in a hoarse voice. Surely, she hadn't conjured Granny Penn up out of some great beyond, had she? It was one thing to be deliciously sure of her Gran dealing out the cards and doing tea-leaf readings for the angels in that other benevolent life, looking down on her granddaughter and protecting her from harm. It was quite another to be confronted with ghostly voices in the dark of night. But since Granny Penn always said it was better to face your demons than to hide from them, she whirled around. How could she ever think Granny Penn was a demon, anyway? "I followed you all the way up here," Dolly wheezed painfully. "I've got a bleeding stitch in my side now, thanks to you. What are you going to do? Throw yourself over the cliffs?" "Of course not. What do you want, anyway?" Amber snapped, fractionally relieved to find the voice belonged to Dolly and not to some spectre. Dolly took a deep, ragged breath. "I want to say I'm sorry. It was a bloody stupid thing to do, but I didn't expect you to get in such a state about it. I've had words with that newspaper chap as well, and told him if he puts that picture of you and Philip Slade in the paper, I'll find him and kick him where it hurts. Mind you, I had to blackmail him as well by saying that as long as the picture doesn't appear, I'll go to the flicks with him one night. He agreed. So you needn't worry about Lukey boy seeing it." She was wheezing even more by the time she finished, and she swayed so alarmingly for a minute that Amber had to catch hold of her to stop her falling. "Are you telling me the truth?" she said. Dolly sighed. "God almighty, I know when I'm beaten, kid, and I don't really want to go back to London with you feeling that badly about me." "You are going, then?" Amber began to think that this was the most bizarre conversation in the most bizarre place she'd ever had. Dolly nodded. "I think it's best, don't you? I miss my mum, God help me, and she needs somebody to take care of her, what with Uncle Joe and his roving eyes." So that was the problem, then. Amber didn't know what to say. Here they were, standing like idiots, not knowing what to do next. Did they hug and say it had been nice knowing each other? It hadn't always been, but there were plenty of times when they had been truly closer than sisters. Moments later, as if to remind them what this night was all about, the church bells suddenly began to ring out the start of a new year. They could hear them far below in the town, and because they were up high on Pendennis Hill, they could hear the sounds of other bells from far away, as if the whole county was in celebration. "I'm going to make a New Year's resolution to be good," Dolly declared after a moment. "What do you think?" "I think pigs might fly," Amber said, and then they were spontaneously hugging one another, laughing and crying and saying sorry for everything and vowing undying friendship. It wouldn't last, but it was good while it did. "Let's go home," Amber said huskily. "I've had enough emotion for one night, and all I want is to fall into bed." They linked arms and began the long walk back to the cottage. The bells were still ringing, filling the air with sound and replacing the need for words. If peace hadn't come to the world yet, at least there was an uneasy and unspoken peace in the Penry cottage. They went their separate ways to work each day and took it in turns to cook the evening meal. The local newspaper appeared with photos of the Forces Club dance and other celebrations, but Amber's wasn't among them. Dolly fulfilled her obligation and went to the cinema with the photographer. All the time, Amber felt as if she was waiting, holding her breath for the time when Luke would come home. A letter arrived from him a week later. She was almost afraid to read it, still not knowing whether Dolly had ever written to him with one of her snide remarks. But she could have wept at the contents. I know I've been a bad letter writer, Amber, but for a time I didn't know what was happening to me. My hearing and memory loss made me very unbalanced, but they've returned to normal now. I didn't want to come back to you feeling like half a man, but I know I'm one of the lucky ones, and now I can't wait to get out of this place. The doctors and nurses have a hell of a hard job to do, but I've had enough of hospitals. I want to get back to normal, doing the ordinary things that people do. For a time, I even felt guilty that I was going to be discharged from the Navy before the war ended, but I no longer feel like that. I know I did my bit, and now I can't wait to get home to see my girl. We've got a lot of time to make up, sweetheart. She hugged the letter to her heart, knowing that his feelings hadn't changed any more than hers had. It was such an honest and uninhibited letter, and she was sure that he couldn't have heard anything bad from Dolly, or he wouldn't have written in that way to her. She was filled with renewed love and hope for the future. His parents, too, had had a letter from him, but theirs was full of his plans for the boatyard once the war was over, when Luke and his father could get back to doing what they loved best. Amber felt momentarily envious of the closeness of their family life, knowing she had no one. But hopefully, in time, she would be part of that family too. She crossed her fingers as she thought it, because it didn't do to tempt fate, no matter how much in love she was. So far, Dolly hadn't said anything more about going back to London, and it was a subject that was left unspoken between them. Once she did, Amber would be alone again, and she was torn between relief at having no more tension between them and knowing she would feel unbearably lonely in the cottage. She couldn't ignore the years they had been together, all the fights and the tantrums, the friendship and the shared secrets too. Dolly would always be a part of her life, no matter how much she tried to deny it. Luke's mother came into the craft shop at the end of January, glowing with excitement, and Amber's heart leaped, knowing what she was going to say. We had a phone call from Luke last night, Amber. It was marvellous to actually hear his voice, and he sounded so close he might almost have been in the room with us. She was about to say more, but before she could do so, she burst into tears. Amber was so embarrassed she didn't know what to do, and then Hester was sniffing and smiling and calling herself all kinds of a fool for getting so soppy. Though I think any mother can be forgiven for feeling soppy when she knows her son is coming home. When? Amber almost croaked. Hester gave her a crooked smile, dabbing her eyes with a hanky and swallowing hard. In 3 days' time. I can hardly believe it. I feel like turning the house upside down and giving it a good spring clean. But Mick says I'm not to be so foolish, or I'll be too exhausted to enjoy it when he comes home. Amber laughed unsteadily, as emotional as Hester. I'm sure he's right, but I know just what you mean. And you'll come to supper with us that evening, won't you, Amber? Even though the invitation was bringing her into the circle, she felt a weird sense of reluctance. I don't know. Should I? I know I'm longing to see Luke, but perhaps he should spend a little time with you first of all. I don't want to impose. Nor did she want to spend those first moments with Luke in the company of his parents, but she could hardly say as much. She wanted him all to herself. She wanted him so much, and perhaps until this very moment when she knew the time had come so close, she had never realized quite how much. Well, you know the invitation stands, my dear, and I'm not sure it's just us that he's most eager to see. She leaned forward and kissed Amber on the cheek. It was the most significant way of letting her know that this was her son's girl, and she had her full approval. By the time Amber got home that evening, she was in a high state of nervous excitement. In 3 days' time, Luke would be home, and their lives would revert to the way they had been before. And yet, she knew they would never be the same again. They had both grown, mentally and physically, in the years since they had argued and teased one another as children. They had been through a war, and it still wasn't over, seen and experienced things they should never have seen, and they were different people now. She had never realised the truth of Mick Gillam's words more. The love was still there, but it was no longer the childish love of those halcyon school days. It was a stronger, more mature love. But it was a love that they had to get to know all over again. "You're mad to get so worried," Dolly told her. "All this time you couldn't wait for him to come home, and now you're having the collywobbles about it." "Thanks for putting it so well," Amber muttered. "I'm just afraid that we'll look at one another and see two different people." "Why should you? It's not as if he's been away for years, is it? He hasn't been shut away in one of those awful POW camps. He's probably been living the life of Riley in those army hospitals, waited on hand and foot by the nurses." Amber didn't take the bait as she would once have done. Luke had told her he loved her, and no matter how many caring and attractive nurses had tended him, she was sure of that love, just as she was sure of hers for him. It wasn't that. She didn't know what it was, but the uneasiness inside her wouldn't go away, just when she had expected to be filled with joy and excitement. She wished desperately that Granny Penn was here to explain the mixture of emotions inside her. Her Gran would be wise enough to know why she was feeling the way she did, but Granny Penn wasn't here and never would be again. The unease persisted for the next few days. If anything, it gathered momentum so that she could hardly eat or sleep, and Dolly became increasingly impatient with her. On the day Luke was due home, she was all fingers and thumbs at work as she dealt with customers. By the end of the afternoon, Mrs. Veal told her to go home early as she wasn't doing much good in the shop. "And for goodness sake, go and have supper with the family like you've been invited. How do you think Luke will feel if you don't turn up to see him? Go and make yourself pretty for your young man and be happy that his parents want you to share in their happiness, my dear." "I am happy," Amber said. "I just haven't made up my mind what to do yet. But I'll do as you say and go home." She cycled home in the late afternoon, wondering what time Luke was coming home. His mother didn't know for certain. He could even be home now. The more she thought about it, the more jittery Amber became. The cottage was silent as usual when she went inside. Dolly wouldn't be home from the club for an hour or more yet, and she decided to turn on the wireless to have some company. That was when she saw the letter propped up against it. She ripped it open, knowing it was Dolly's handwriting. What now? "By the time you read this, I'll be gone," Dolly had written. "It seemed like the best time to go, before Lukey boy came home, and I didn't want to make a big fuss about saying goodbye. We had some good times, Amber, and some bad ones too. I'm not likely to forget you, but it's time I went back where I belong. And I decided to leave while you were at work. I never did write to Luke, and I wanted to be sure and tell you that. I was tempted to, mind, but in the end I never did it, and that's the God's honest truth. He'd never have looked at me while you were around anyway. You were always his girl. A proper little Cornish maid, as Granny Penn used to say. I'm not likely to forget her either. If I ever did the right thing instead of the wrong one, it was due to her. So you can thank her for that. Anyway, you won't want me hanging around like a spare part when Luke comes home, will you? Have a good life, Amber. And if you feel like writing to me now and then, you'll know where I am. And you better invite me to the wedding, or I'll have something to say about it. Your friend and soul sister, Dolly." Amber's heart was banging in her chest by the time she finished reading the letter. She wasn't sure she believed that Dolly had really gone, and then she was rushing upstairs and into Dolly's bedroom, wrenching open cupboards and drawers. There was nothing of hers left. No clothes, no makeup, no screwed-up bits of paper, no books, no odd shoes lurking beneath the bed, no chaos. It was as if she had never been here at all. The next moment, Amber was in floods of tears. It was all so final. It was like an unexpected death, with no chance to say goodbye or to make amends for the wrongs that had gone before. No matter who had done them, or how small, there was always recompense to be made, regrets to express, undying love to avow. She took a deep, shuddering breath, knowing how foolish she was being. This was what they both wanted, wasn't it? It was something that was inevitable. They had met so unwillingly and gone through a short lifetime of emotions together, but now it had ended, as all things came to an end, and Amber was finally alone. How long she sat on Dolly's bed she didn't know. She had clenched her hands together for so long. She had dug her fingernails into her palms by the time she heard the footsteps on the gravel outside, and then the click of the door latch as somebody opened it. Nobody locked their doors around here. It must be Dolly, of course. And for a wild moment a mixture of new emotions ran through her. Dolly wasn't leaving her after all, and they could finally be grown up about all this and be the friends and sisters they'd always wanted to be. And then, how dare Dolly scare her with that daft letter when she hadn't gone back to London? And if this wasn't just like her, she had always fancied herself as a bit of an actress, and she had played this particular part very well. "Is anybody home?" She heard a familiar male voice call out. If her heart had been pounding before, it was ready to burst now. But this would be the very worst time, when she knew so well who the owner of the voice would be. She leapt off the bed and abandoned all the memories that could stay stored away in her mind as she flew down the stairs and into Luke's waiting arms. "Well, that's the best greeting I've had yet," Luke said, when they had finally broken away, but with their arms still tightly entwined around one another. "Are you expecting any more?" Amber said, tongue-tied for a moment from the unbridled passion in that spectacular kiss. "I don't want any more. I only want my girl. I've missed you so much, and those weeks when I lost my memory were the worst. But whatever else I forgot, it was never you, Amber. You were like a golden light at the end of a tunnel, and I knew I was always going to reach you." "Oh," she said softly, "that's so lovely. It's almost worthy of Granny Penn." "You're worthy of Granny Penn, my darling. You've grown up so beautiful, and she'd be very proud of you. I want to keep looking at you and touching you to remind myself how beautiful and how real you are. You're no longer just in my dreams, but you're right here in my arms." For a moment she was embarrassed at how intensely he was looking at her now. It was as if he was looking into her soul, at everything she had been or done while he was away, and just as instantly she knew she had nothing to fear. He was the one who had been through so much, but the weeks of recuperation had evidently done their work, and he seemed as strong and whole as he ever was. She felt the gentle touch of his hand against her breast, sending the old, familiar tingling sensations through her, and since she couldn't be unaware of his growing passion, she had to ask, "Luke, are you sure? Are you quite recovered?" she asked tentatively. "Your memory and your hearing and the physical wounds?" He gave his old remembered smile.
The day I forget how to make love to my girl and can't hear the sweet music of her voice will be a long day coming, sweetheart. Anything else has long since recovered. We've got a lifetime ahead of us to talk, and I know you'll want to know what happened to me, but right now, there's only one thing I want to do to make my homecoming complete, providing there's no one else in the house.
He couldn't make his intentions more plain, nor could they be more reciprocated.
"There's no one but the two of us, Luke,"
Amber whispered. It wasn't the done thing for the girl to take the initiative, but for a brief moment she had seen a question in his eyes. Did he think for one instant that she didn't want them to be lovers once more? That she hadn't been waiting all her life for them to be together in the way God meant true soulmates to be? As she stood up, she caught his hand, and they moved towards the stairs, arms still wrapped around one another.
There's one more thing I've got to ask you, Amber, he said gravely.
She paused, wondering even now if she should have waited, been less eager. But it wasn't in her nature, and he knew that only too well. He turned her into him, his hands cupping her face, and everything she wanted to see was in his eyes, and she knew she needn't have worried.
Please say you'll marry me as soon as possible, because I don't think I can bear to wait a second longer than necessary to have you with me for always.
Her answer was in the kiss she gave him, and from somewhere in the ether, Amber thought she could imagine a faint sense of a certain granny pen breaking off from her angelic card reading to give them her blessing. The moment vanished as quickly as it came, and any such unworldly thoughts were far from Amber's mind in the joy of this special night when Luke would become finally and totally hers. You have been listening to A Cornish Maid by Rachel Moore, read by Tanya.